Hello and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in 10 Plus Years. This is Easter Sunday 2023, and today I want to look at 1 Corinthians 15. By the way, I did finish my explanatory notes on Jesus' resurrection and have self-published that. It covers all the passages we've been doing for the last few weeks, and I'll do John 21 next Sunday. I skipped a Sunday because I was writing that. But today we're doing 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11, which is, of course, the earliest testimony to the resurrection. Because even though, sometimes you think, well, the Gospels are about Jesus, so they're earlier, and Paul, he came later. Well, that's true in terms of history, but not in terms of the writing of the books. 1 Corinthians is the first real substantial testimony to the resurrection, dating to maybe the year 54, 55, whereas the Gospels, I would date Mark, and this is not a controversial date, around 69 to 70 A.D., and that's the earliest one. Matthew probably to the late 70s, Luke probably to the 80s, John to the 90s. I'm not, that's not controversial particularly, although there are those who disagree. So 1 Corinthians 15 is early testimony. And that's very significant. The reason why it's very significant is because there's some who've talked about, some of these resurrection beliefs and Jesus beliefs as if it's like the telephone game. You whisper in one ear, they whisper in another ear. By the time it gets to the end, it's all mangled, and you go, ha, 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 here's what I said originally. But it's not like that at all. For one thing, this is only 25 years-ish, less than 25 years after the resurrection. These people are still alive. He mentions 500 brothers and sisters, who saw Jesus, many of whom he says are still alive. In other words, check my references. Also, Paul is writing the Corinthian church. He had opponents there. He had people who didn't like him in the broader church. I think he had people in the Jerusalem church that didn't like him. So if he was making this up, there would have been we would have found traces of that in 2 Corinthians and such. As far as we can tell, nobody pushes back on this. They push back on other things. They don't push back on this, because Paul here is not coming up with something that is uniquely Paul's idea. He is passing on common Christian tradition. Well, with that, let's dive into this early witness, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. I'm looking at interlinearbible.org or BibleHub.com. I'm looking at that in the video version, and of course, you're not looking at that if you're listening to the podcast version. Let's go. Verse 1. Now, I make known to you, brothers and sisters, the gospel that I preached to you, which also you received, in which also you have stood and are still standing. Okay, so sometimes there's debate about what the word gospel, we go through phases, I think, in biblical studies, at least in relation to the public, where you've got these kind of trendy topics. The gospel was all the rage about 10 years ago. I even wrote an article on it for the Dictionary of the New Testament, I believe it was, with IVP, if I remember correctly. But what is the gospel? Well, because we talk about sharing the gospel, and it's easy for people to think that what we're talking about is a plan of salvation, repent, believe, confess, receive. Whereas really, the focal point of the gospel is the fact that Jesus is King. That Jesus, He is Lord, He is Lord. He is risen from the dead and He is Lord. That's the focal point of the gospel. That Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, is Lord of all. God has made Him Lord in Christ. Acts 2:36, I believe it is. He was proclaimed to be, appointed to be the Son of God, empowered by the resurrection of the dead, Romans 1:13. Romans 10:9, if you believe in your heart, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised Him from the dead, you'll be saved. See the parallel between confessing Him as Lord and believing in the resurrection. So the resurrection, the exaltation of Jesus, and enthronement of Jesus at God's right hand, that's the core of the gospel. But there is also, of course, the story that goes along with that, which Paul is going to tell us here in a second. So there are some, like Scott McKnight, who point especially to this passage in 1 Corinthians 15, as the core of where we find out what the gospel is. More on that in a second. Let's read verse 2. Through which also you are being saved, by which word I proclaim the good news to you, that if you hold fast, unless in vain you have believed. Paul doesn't believe in eternal security. He just doesn't. That you have to stand fast in what you believed in order to be saved, which for Paul, salvation is primarily future-oriented. Salvation is escaping the coming judgment of God. And so you are in the process of getting there. You're not saved yet in that sense because the judgment hasn't happened yet. But you are being saved through this good news that Paul preached to them if they hold it fast. And so there is the good news has really good news for us. The good news is about Jesus primarily, but it has very good news implications for you and me, namely that we can be saved. So what is the content here? Let's go down to verse 3. For I delivered to you among the first principles what I also received. So again, Paul's passing on tradition. Paul didn't come up with this. This is what Peter thinks. This is what James thinks. This is what headquarters thinks in Jerusalem. This is not something that Paul made up. This is ground zero of the Jesus movement. What is this thing that Paul delivered as first principles that he also received? Here's what it is: that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. There is an atonement element to the good news that sins, and we shouldn't just individualize it. We are Western individualists. We tend to think about, Yahoo, I'm saved. Thank God I am saved, saved, saved. Anyway, that's all true, of course, but that's making it all about me. The salvation first is the salvation of the people of God, which of course originally was especially understood in terms of the salvation of Israel. So there is a dying for the collective sins of Israel, and of course, within the people of God, death for all of us. Now, the for is very general, right? There's not a detailed substitutional penal theory of atonement here. It's a one preposition. He died for. He died to take care of them. It doesn't give the mechanism of it Now, there is a sense, I think, of him taking our place. I think there's a little bit of substitution in there. There's a little bit of satisfaction. He's fixing the order of things is out of alignment. He's fixing it. But he died for our sins according to Scriptures. What Scriptures? Well, I suspect probably Isaiah 53 is somewhere in the back of here. He was bruised. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities, probably especially that. Verse 4, that he was buried and that he has been raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. I like the tense here. It's perfect tense. He was raised and he remains raised. And it happened on the third day, where again, a part of a day, it can be considered a day. So there's Friday before sundown. There's sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. And then there's Sunday up until the morning when he is raised. So three days. According to the Scriptures, no doubt some of the Scriptures that we see in the New Testament are involved here. Psalm 16, he would not let his Holy One see corruption. Psalm 110:1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for my feet, and others. Psalm 2:7, you are my son, today I've given you birth. 2 Samuel 7:14, I will be his father, he will be my son. All of these are arguably Scriptures that the earliest Christians read in terms of Jesus. So that's the core of the gospel there. His atoning death and his victorious resurrection that makes it all possible. And of course, if we were to do all of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul would make it clear that Christ is just the first fruits. The first fruits, we will be the rest of the fruits when the resurrection happens, when Christ returns. So, verse 5, that he appeared, he was seen by Peter, or actually Cephas is what Paul says, which is Paul knows this guy. Cephas is the Aramaic, right? Peter is a Greek translation. I don't know that Jesus ever said the words Petros, those sounds, while he was on the earth. That's a translation when the gospel hits Greek land, Greek-speaking land. His name in Aramaic is Cephas. That's the name that Jesus gave him. You are Cephas. You are rock. And the rock in Matthew is the confession of Jesus as the Christ. He appeared to see Peter first. Very curious, of course, and I talk about this, by the way. I put 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11 in my book, Explanatory Notes on Jesus' Resurrection. I start off kind of talking about the theology of the resurrection in the New Testament, and then I next go to 1 Corinthians 15 as the next part. So I say some of these things in the book. He appeared to Cephas. Now, this isn't narrated. Isn't that amazing? That this is the first appearance, not the first appearance in the Gospels, of course. He appears first to Mary Magdalene. You could argue that Mary Magdalene is the first apostle, the first person that Jesus appears to, and the first one that Jesus sends as a witness to the resurrection. So Paul maybe shows a little bit the male bias of the culture when he talks about Cephas first. But Cephas is the first of the 12 to whom Jesus appeared, for sure. But we don't know about it. I mean, Luke 24 just kind of, as we saw, just kind of slips it in there. And he's appeared to Peter. Wait a minute. That's important. I don't think it's John 21 because there are others there with Peter in John 21. It maybe I have a feeling that the original ending of Mark told us about that. But unfortunately, it's been lost, if indeed there is a lost ending. As we now have it, the oldest manuscripts of Mark end with verse 8. And it's the women told no one because they were afraid. There's the implication that Jesus would appear to people in Galilee, but it doesn't tell it. I'm guessing that Jesus appeared to Peter in Galilee. Luke, as we've talked about, he syncopates the appearances in Luke 24. It's almost like it's one day, and he doesn't tell anything about the appearances in Galilee. The appearance of the Great Commission was in Galilee. So there was an appearance to Peter that was very important, obviously. Then to the 12. Now, we do read about two appearances to the 12. Well, two appearances. We read about an appearance on Easter night, so Sunday evening, in both Luke 24 and John 20. This is all in my explanatory notes. In John 20 and Luke 24, Jesus appears to the disciples that night. And then 8 days later, John 20 tells us that he appeared to Thomas because Thomas wasn't there. Now 12 here, I think, is a round number because obviously Judas isn't there, and I doubt that Matthias is included in it. So the 12 is just a shorthand for the core disciples. But he appeared to them. That's narrated in Luke and John. Verse 6, then he was seen by more than 500 brothers and sisters at once, from whom the majority remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. So we don't know what this event was. Maybe it was the event of the Great Commission. Maybe there were a lot of people there. Maybe it's talking about the ascension in Acts 1, that there are a lot of people there. We know there are 120 people in the upper room. But so that doesn't sound like quite as many. But maybe there were 500 when he ascended. Again, we don't know when this appearance to 500 was, but he says, check my references. It may be that Andronicus and Junia, mentioned in Romans 16:7, maybe they were it says in Romans 16:7, they were prominent among the apostles. And Paul says they were Christians before he was. They were believers before he was. So it sounds like, again, it's very possible that he's saying that Andronicus and Junia, this male-female husband-wife pair, were apostles. And it maybe they were part of the 500, maybe. Or maybe they belong in verse 7. Verse 7 says, then he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. So it may be that's where they go. Maybe Andronicus and Junia go in verse 7. Of course, there's the men on the road to Emmaus. We don't know whether they were sent out, Cleopas. We don't know whether they went out or not. But James here is Jesus' probably half-brother, that is Mary and Joseph's child after Jesus was born of her as a virgin. So Jesus' half-brother. James wasn't real supportive of Jesus along with the rest of the family while he was in Galilee, apparently. But I can imagine this was an interesting conversation when Jesus appears to James and says, so, James, turns out I was right, eh? What do you think about that? Eh? I'm sure Jesus was kind to him. But James, of course, goes on to become the leader of the Jerusalem church. In Acts 15, it's James that pronounced the verdict at the Jerusalem Council on whether or not Gentiles have to be circumcised in order to be saved. James is martyred in about 62 because he's under the skin of the high priest. And of course, it's the book of James in the New Testament. So we have kind of two tiers here. We have the disciples who were with Jesus during his ministry, first to Peter, then to the 12, then by 500 people who followed him presumably at one point. And then we have the second tier, which are the apostles, James, the others, maybe Barnabas. Barnabas might be in this group. He's called an apostle at one point in Acts. I think it's chapter 14. And then we get to the last of these apostles. There are no apostles like these anymore. These are the apostles to whom Jesus appeared in bodily form and whom Jesus sent to proclaim to be witnesses of the resurrected Jesus because they'd seen him. Now, there may be somebody that Jesus appears bodily to today. I don't know. I don't know anybody. Hasn't done that to me. I'd be delighted. Pick me. So. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit into other areas, but when Paul is qualifying himself as an apostle in 1 Corinthians 9:1, he says, "Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus?" There is nobody alive today who's an apostle of a New Testament sort like that. Now, there are people who are just merely sent apostles. I think in maybe Philippians 3, we hear about one, Epaphroditus, maybe, if I'm remembering correctly. Maybe. Look it up. But Paul is the last of these apostles. Verse 8. "And last of all, as to one born out of time, he was seen also by me." He appeared also to me. This is a pregnancy that went on probably for 3 years, as it were. That's that would be uncomfortable, I would guess. But Paul seems to have seen the risen Lord in about the year AD 33, by my calculations. Again, we can't know for sure, to be honest. But Paul's the last. Verse 9, "For I myself am the least of the apostles, who am not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the assembly of God." By the way, Paul does collect the garments of the people who crucified, or not who crucified, the garments of the people who stoned Stephen, but it doesn't say he threw any stones. We actually have no actual evidence that Paul killed anybody. He goes to Damascus to arrest Christians to bring them back. He's a messenger, but we don't. But Paul did persecute the church. He did arrest Christians, no doubt operating on behalf of the Sanhedrin. These were troublemakers. These were people who were seen as a liability to Israel in relation to the Romans. And as far as the Sanhedrin is concerned, they might not have cared a lick what they actually were believing, but they saw them as people who were a threat to their power, their position with the Romans. They were afraid the Romans would cause real problems if they didn't keep these things under control. Paul, as we know in Acts 9, he goes to Damascus to bring some troublemakers, back to Jerusalem for a trial of some kind. And in the meantime, Jesus appears to him and he becomes a believer himself. He persecuted the church of God, the assembly of God. That's where the denomination gets its name, an ecclesia of God. Nobody thought called out ones. That's the etymological fallacy where you break a word apart, and you say, this is what it means. I mean, it had been an assembly for hundreds and hundreds of years. We have a kind of a non-historical way of looking at these things sometimes. It was just a word that people used, like the word understand. Nobody stands under anything when they understand. But it may have had a history in the Hebrew word yachad. The Dead Sea Scrolls talk about the yachad of Israel, the gathering of Israel, the assembly of Israel, the together of Israel. And so this may imply some, relationship between early Christians and the Essene movement. Maybe not. It's very speculative. This is an unusual place for Paul to use the word ecclesia in reference to more than one church. Most of the time when he talks about an ecclesia, he means a local assembly, like the local assembly at Corinth, for example. But he persecuted the Yachad of God, maybe, the church of God, the new Israel, the eschatological Israel, the new people, the new temple, the group through which God would restore Israel as a people and a nation, not in the modern sense, but as a people group with independence. And in fact, they would become the focal point of the whole world. So he wasn't fit. I mean, there's a kind of like a little sheepishness about, should I be called an apostle? Because I used to really persecute these people. Although I think he primarily persecuted the Greek-speaking Jewish church. I don't think he primarily persecuted the Aramaic-speaking church like Peter and so forth. But, he feels a little sheepish about even calling himself an apostle because he's got history. But verse 10, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me has not happened in vain. Grace is unmerited favor, right? Grace is a gift from God that we don't deserve. It's not that we can't ask for it. There's a lot of misunderstanding of the way grace worked. Grace was patron-client language, where, yes, it is disproportionate, but you could do things that could lead a patron to believe that you merited it. And if you insulted, your giver, don't expect to continue to get grace. You can see this in Hebrews 10, around verse 26, insulting the spirit of grace. So there are a lot, read John Barclay's work, Paul and the Gift. But the grace is a gift we don't deserve, or at least we didn't earn. And God was willing to give it. And if God was willing to give grace, then the church better be okay with it, right? Because God is the one that gets to forgive. God forgives us all. Remember the parable of the unforgiving servant? So God has forgiven Paul. The church had better forgive Paul as well. And Paul, just to be honest here, even though I didn't deserve it, even though I was a persecutor, but I have labored more abundantly than all of them. Not I, but the grace of God that is in me. Make it very clear, it wasn't me doing it, it was God doing it. But I have worked pretty hard. And of course he did. God would have no doubt used somebody else if it had not been Paul. But if Paul, in the way it actually unfolded, if there had been no Paul, the church would not have spread the way it spread. He was the one that pushed it out. I mean, the disciples they're playing tiddlywinks back in Jerusalem, right? Paul's the one who's in Greece. Paul's the one who uses his Roman citizenship to go to Rome. The gospel was already in Rome by the time he got there. But what I'm getting at is God used Paul mightily. I don't think anybody can doubt that. 13 letters have his name on it in the New Testament. That's more than any other author. And so clearly God used Paul and mightily used Paul. Even though he was the least of the apostles, his impact was not the least in the slightest. Verse 12, therefore, whether it's me or them, so we are preaching, and so you have believed. This is common. This gospel is common. It's not just me. This is common gospel. This is what the disciples in Jerusalem preach. This is what headquarters preaches. This is what we are preaching. We're all preaching it. All Christians are preaching it, and this is what you have put your faith in as well. Well, this has been Easter Sunday through the Bible in 10 years, and we've looked at 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 11. He is risen. He is risen indeed.